Welcome. In this video, I will explain the California Association of Realtors Residential Purchase Agreement quickly for both buyers and sellers and in an easy to follow format. Hello, my name is Brian Schweitke. I've been a realtor and transition specialist since 2004. I'm located here in Los Gatos, California. My purpose is simply to serve and to educate. My goal is to give clarity, certainty, and confidence, and to save my clients time, money, and frustration. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to explain the residential purchase agreement quickly. I'm only going to focus on the most important things, not every line. That would take forever. I can do that in person if you'd like, but for this video, I'm just going to try and keep it as short as I possibly can. I'm not going to actually show you the contract in the video because it is a copywritten document. And the contract is always changing, so I'm not going to refer to item numbers because things will change. The contract is changing probably every year. And so what I'm going to do is I'm also going to explain it for both buyers and for sellers. For buyers, you want to know what's going to make your offer, more appealing or less attractive. I call them knobs that you can turn. And for the sellers, what to look out for, what to watch for, red flags, what you're really concerned with. Okay? So in general, my goal usually for a purchase agreement, for a real estate transaction in general, whether I'm on the buy side or the sell side, is I'm trying not to be adversarial. I want the parties to try and cooperate, because the buyers are always going to think that they're paying too much. The sellers are always going to think that they gave it away, but everybody really wants the same thing. Even the realtors, everybody wants to make the transition go through, and we want to end ideally on a good note. That we have a friendly relationship, and you can come over and see the house after the remodeled. We can meet at the end and tell you how things work and whatnot. It's just trying to go for a win-win situation. So the contract is pretty standard. The RPA, or Residential Purchase Agreement, is a standard contract that almost everybody in California uses. There are derivatives of the contract, like the PRDS contract and other things, but mostly all the contracts pretty much say the same thing. And what we're looking for when we're writing an offer or reviewing an offer is we're looking for those blank lines that are filled in, those empty check boxes that may have been checked, and the bold type or capital letters, okay? And the rest of it is pretty boilerplate verbiage. So if you want more detailed explanation of the contract, I have another video. It's an hour-long video. It's been viewed over 10,000 times on YouTube, so I can send that to you if you're having trouble sleeping or you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, or I can just do it with you in person. So at a minimum, what we really want to know, or what the most important things in the contract are what the purchase price is, the deposit amount, the loan amount, the cash amount, or maybe it's all cash. Then we want to know what the close of escrow time period is, what the loan terms are, what the interest rate is. Do we have a pre-approval letter from a major lender? Is there proof of funds that I know you have the money you say you have? The financing contingencies, whether there's an appraisal contingency or a loan contingency. Is the offer contingent upon the sale of a buyer's current home before they can make the transition or make the transaction work with the current home that they're purchasing? Who pays what? What's included and what's excluded? Will there be a seller rent back? Maybe the seller can't move right away, right after the close of escrow. They need a week or two after that. There's called a seller rent back. Then we want to know what the property contingencies are, the removal time periods of those contingencies, and the expiration of the offer. So let's get right into it. The first and foremost, the most important document we have is called the agency relationship. And really what this is who has a relationship with whom. So there are three agency relationships. The first agency relationship is the seller and the listing agent. The listing agent is the marketing agent. And so that's the initial relationship. And then there's another relationship, a second relationship, which is the buyer and the buyer's agent. And that buyer's agent is actually called the selling agent. So when a seller goes to list their home, really they're hiring two realtors. They're hiring the listing agent to do all of the marketing, and they're hiring a buyer's agent to do the actual selling, telling the buyer, this is the right side of the tracks, the wrong side of the tracks, good school, return on investment, things like that. So two agents. So then that's the third relationship, is the seller with the selling agent, because the seller is going to be paying that agent. It's kind of weird, but there's 3 agency relationships. Super important. In their agency relationship, it also talks about the duties of the agents, and they both have the same duties. So really the duty is a fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty, a duty of honest and fair dealing and in good faith, and also to disclose all of the facts that the realtors know that could affect the value and desirability of the property. That's really what the agency relationship is saying at the top. Now, the agent, it's saying here in the agency relationship that in California, it's actually legal for the listing agent to act as both agents, both for the seller and for the buyer. But I kind of think that's pretty much a conflict of interest, because how can I say to the seller, I'm going to get you the most money I can possibly get you for that house, for your house, and tell the buyer I'm going to get them the best deal possible? It's a conflict of interest, almost like going to court when there's only one attorney. So if that ever happens, I usually refer it to somebody in my office and they can write up the offer. I don't want to have that conflict of interest. So if it does happen, it's happened to me a couple of times in my career where, it's a slam dunk, it's all cash, it's as is, please just write up the paperwork. As long as the seller and the buyer are aware of it and they consent to it, okay? But there's a caveat there, is that the agent, if he's going to represent both parties, he can't disclose the minimum price that the seller will take or the maximum price the buyer will offer, okay? So that's the caveat there. So that's the first page of our agency relationship. Now, hopefully you're going through this contract with me. As you watch this on the computer, you can pause it at any time. So I'm just going through the contract with you. The second page of the agency relationship is pretty much just a bunch of definitions. If you don't know what the word agent means, or buyer, or dual agent, or seller's agent, or listing price, something like that, there are the definitions there. And then there's also some basic terms and conditions at the bottom, and no one actually signs this page. So that's the second page of the agency relationship. Most important document of the entire thing. That document should be at the top, on top of every document that comes to you. The first one you see should be the agency relationship. Next one you're going to see is a possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. The agency relationship was for the agents. This one is for the brokers, the Keller Williams, the Interos, the Century 21s, that they may represent more than one buyer or seller, which is kind of obvious because you see signs all over the place. They don't just have one client. So that's a dual agency. So if I put a sign in the lawn and then another Keller Williams agent put another sign in the lawn next to me, that's kind of a dual agency, but it's, each agent is an independent agent. And so that is going to happen, okay? And one thing that you should know in this document, that it actually says that the buyer is advised that the seller or the listing agent may disclose the existence, terms, or conditions of the buyer's offer, because sometimes the buyers think, my offer is confidential. And sometimes you'll talk to a listing agent and you'll say, what's the best price you have? And they say, well, I can't tell you. But actually it says right here that you can. So that information is not confidential, just to let you know that, okay? So everybody will sign that document, and then they'll be on to the next document, which is the Wire Fraud and Electronic Funds Transfer Advisory. And what this is saying is that there are reports that indicate that some hackers have been able to intercept email transfer instructions. They can obtain account information, and by altering some of that data, they can redirect the funds to a different account. And this is happening all over the place. Really, you shouldn't be very, very careful when you're wiring money. And if you get an email from your realtor that says, and it looks like it's from them or the title company, it says, hey, here's what you should do. You should transfer some money. That's not them, probably. Okay, we would never tell you to transfer money via email. Okay, so you're advised to obtain these phone numbers and account numbers only from the escrow officers, and don't ever wire electronically any funds prior to calling and confirming what those instructions are and talking with an escrow officer, okay? And also avoid sending any personal information via email or text, okay? So it's just the day and age that we live in. You'll sign the bottom of that, and we'll be on to the next page, which is the actual California Association of Realtors purchase agreement. And so what we're looking for here are, like I said before, any lines that have been filled in, check boxes that have been checked, bold type, capital letters, things like that. So right at the top, we're talking about the offer. So what date it was prepared, the buyer's name, the address, and the APN, or the assessor's parcel number. That's like the license plate on your car. Every home has a unique APN. The purchase price is written in and numerical, okay, just like a check. And then there's a checkbox that says the close of escrow date will be either a date or calendar days. Now, I usually don't like to do a date because things change. I like to do calendar days. Is it 5, 21, 30 days, 45 days after acceptance? Okay. Then it comes down and talks about agency. And we've already talked about agency, but what it's doing is it checks a box that says that that agency relationship, the initial document that we had, now becomes part of this document, part of the purchase agreement. Okay. So that box needs to be checked. And so then there's going to be broker information, who's representing the seller, who's representing the buyer. And then there's the check mark that says possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. That's then pulling in that other document into this document, saying that the brokers actually can have multiple relationships. Okay, now we move on to financing terms. And what it's going to spell out is the initial deposit. The initial deposit is called liquidated damages, and that's in case the buyer backs out after they said they wouldn't back out, or after they remove their contingencies. So this is the 3% that is paid by the buyer. A check is written, or money is wired to the title company. The title company then cashes the check, or the money is liquid in the title company in their account. And then if the buyer backs out at the end, after they've removed their contingencies, that money is up for grabs. Now, it doesn't say that the seller just gets it, but we'll talk about liquidated damages a little later in this presentation. The liquidated damages amount, or the initial deposit, is usually about 3% of the purchase price. That's very standard. And it could be electronic funds or check or whatever it may be. And then it is due 3 business days. And that's very important. That's a knob we can turn. When I say knob, that means that it makes a buyer's offer better. That's what the seller wants to see. So the buyer can turn these knobs to make their offer look better or worse. Now, 3 days is standard. If you want your contract to really get the attention of a seller, you'll say, hey, I'll have that deposit into the title company in 24 hours. That's a nice knob to turn. Like I said, it just sits there. It becomes part of the purchase price. And, if no one backs out or nothing happens, that money's just going to go towards the purchase price. So it's 3 business days. The day one is always the day after acceptance. Okay, the next day. Then there's information in here about increased deposit. We don't usually use that all very much. Then there's a special box called all cash offer. Woo! We love seeing the all cash offer. And so if it is an all cash offer, it's going to say that the offer is not contingent upon the buyer obtaining a loan. Okay. And the written verification of the sufficient funds are there. I want to see proof of funds. I want to see how much there is in that account. Now we go down to loans. Okay. Talking about the loans, if there is a loan, if it's not all cash, there's going to be a loan. We're going to want the loan amount, the type of financing, the interest rate. Is it fixed? Is it variable? Is it a VA or a FHA loan? Things like that. And then there's the balance of the down payment, and all of that equals the purchase price. So we've got the deposit plus the loan plus the additional down payment equals purchase price. And so you'll see at the bottom of that first page, the buyers are going to initial on the left, sellers are going to initial on the right. And you're going to be initialing every page until you get to the very last page, that's where you sign. Okay. The next is the appraisal contingency, because if there's a loan, there's going to be an appraisal, and the loan or the deal might be contingent upon the house appraising for the actual sales price. So it says this agreement is or is not contingent upon the written approval of the property, written appraisal of the property. And the buyer shall remove the appraisal contingency or cancel the agreement within 17 days. knob you can turn. I want to see that as low as possible. An appraisal can happen in 4 or 5 days. Why do we need 17 days? If the line is left blank, it means that the default is 17. If the line is filled in, it cancels out the default of 17, and someone might put 0 or 5 or 3 or something like that. Okay? Then we talk about the loan terms. The loan application needs to be there within 3 days, or it's attached. It's probably attached. As a listing agent, I want to see the contract. Well, first the agency, and then the contract. Then I want to see a pre-approval letter from a lender, and I want to see proof of funds. All that come to me with the contract. Then there's a loan contingency removal. So first was appraisal contingency, now there's loan contingency. These are all financing contingencies. The loan contingency removal is 21 days. Another knob, I want to see it be removed as fast as possible. The lender is going to give you the green light to remove your loan contingencies for the buyer. So I would think that that could happen in 14 days, maybe 7 days. Some people are actually pre-approved right before they get there, so we don't have to worry about that. But in the time frames, it's talking about paragraph 14. Now, I said I wasn't going to name any line numbers, but paragraph 14 is paramount. That covers all of the time frames of when everything's going to happen and when those contingencies are going to be removed. And then there's another box that says no loan contingency. So even if it's all cash, you don't even have to worry about that because there's no loan. But if there's a loan, sometimes people say, I don't need a loan contingency. Great knob to see for the seller. Buyer, it's a little scary, but in this market and in this day and age, sometimes that buyers are going in with no loan contingency. Okay, next thing is just some other terms. This is what's called the sale of the buyer's property. So the offer is contingent or is not contingent upon the sale of the buyer's property. And if it is contingent, then you'll need a COP addendum, and you'll attach that to the contract. But that knob is not good. When a seller sees that the buyer has to sell their home before they can buy the seller's home, they're probably going to try and look at a different offer. It depends on the market, it depends on the situation, but we don't usually see a whole lot of contingent offers on the buyer selling their home. Then below that are all of the other documents that are now attached or included in this document. So there's the buyer's inspection advisory, the buyer beware. One of those is actually attached to the listing agreement too. It's pretty much the seller beware, it's the seller's advisory. Then you can check off other boxes for other documents you want to attach, like a probate or a trust or a short sale or a REO or anything else. You can attach documents to this and it becomes part of the terms and conditions of this contract. Next is the allocation of cost. Who's paying for what? Okay, so the seller is going to be paying for the natural hazards disclosure statement, or the NHDS. And what that is it's a report that says if you're in a flood zone, a fire zone, an earthquake zone, if there's a endangered red-toed tree frog that lives in the neighborhood, something, it's the natural hazards disclosure statement. Seller pays for that and gives it to the buyer as a disclosure. And then all of the inspections and the reports, the sellers are going to probably pay for those as well. Then we get to a red flag. It's the government requirements and retrofit. And I don't like that retrofit word. So I'll go with the first one, number one, where it says that the buyer, usually the seller, will pay for smoke alarms in each bedroom, a carbon monoxide detector on every floor, and a water heater that's braced and preferably double braced. Now here's what the one I don't like is where it says that the buyer and seller shall pay for the cost of compliance with any other minimum mandatory government inspections and reports if required as conditioning or as a condition of the close of escrow under any law. Does anyone even know what that means? I don't think so. I don't know the accordance with state law. So when the buyer's agent checks that, that's a red flag to me as a listing agent. I'm going to actually have to send them a counteroffer that says, please remove those. First, I'll ask them, do you even know what it means? Secondly, I'll say, take it out of there. Okay? So that's kind of a red flag, something I don't like to see in the contracts. Okay, next thing is title and escrow. So who's paying for what? Remember, the seller pays the escrow fee, the seller pays the title fee, and it will say who is the escrow holder. In Santa Clara County, the seller chooses who the escrow company is going to be, title company. In other counties, the buyer picks, but in Santa Clara County, the seller picks. So it's usually written in there, seller's choice. And there's some other costs, like the seller shall pay county transfer tax, the seller shall pay the city transfer tax. These are all percentages of the sale price of the home. And in San Jose, Mountain View, and Palo Alto, the buyer and the seller actually split the cost of the city transfer tax. So who's paying for what? More on Homeowners Association, or HOA docs. So the HOA documents themselves, the seller pays for this HOA document to give to the buyer, okay, as a disclosure. But who's going to pay for the rest? Buyer and seller might pay for the HOA transfer fee. The buyer is definitely going to pay for the HOA cert fee. That's to give to the lender. And then there's other costs involved down here, or if you want somebody to pay for something, you would then fill those lines in, check those boxes. Now we come to the home warranty, which is very standard for a buyer to ask a seller to pay for a 1-year home warranty. That means everything under the roof, everything in that house, all the components and appliances and the water heater and everything is covered by this 1-year home warranty, and it's usually costs about $500, and the buyer usually asks the seller to pay that. If the buyer wants to make their offer look a little bit better, the buyer can waive the cost of the home warranty, turn that knob to make it nicer for the seller. But seller, don't be alarmed when the buyer is asking you to pay for a 1-year home warranty. It's very standard. Now we talk about the items that are included and excluded. So everything that's included is everything that's actually attached to the home. The chandeliers, the toilets, everything that's actually attached. And in addition to those things that are attached, there's some things that are not attached, but usually come with a home, like a stove or a refrigerator, a washer and dryer. So if you want those items, the buyer wants those items, they'll check those boxes to say, hey, I want this stuff too. If the seller doesn't want to get rid of their stove, then they're not going to want that box checked. If the box is not checked, then the seller has to get rid of those items because they're not attached to the home, they're personal property. Okay, now let's talk about excluded items. These are personal property items that are not attached to the home, and the buyer might want to exclude that, like the shed or some firewood or some household items or some household hazardous waste or the TV bracket. Because the TV is not attached to the house, but the bracket is attached to the house. There's sometimes your furniture is attached to the house with a brace for earthquake stuff. So if the buyer doesn't want that stuff, they're going to specify that, and they're going to check a little box that says, if the brackets are removed, then the holes should be repaired. So look for that box, both buyers and sellers, okay? All right, now we're going to talk about closing and possession. So the buyer, this is going to tell you if the buyer is going to actually live in the home or flip it or rent it out, because it says the buyer intends to or does not intend to occupy the property. Then it talks about possession, okay? So after the close of escrow or on the day of the close of escrow, the standard is you get to possess the house or change hands at 6:00 p.m. But houses usually record with the county at noon. So between the time noon and 6 p.m., the house is going to be empty. Nobody can get in because the seller isn't the owner anymore. And you can't take possession until 6 p.m., but there's a line there. So as a buyer, you might want to put 2 o'clock or something like that so that you don't lose any amount of time when you get the movers lined up or something like that. Then it talks about the seller remaining in possession after the close of escrow, okay? And they can do that. That's a seller rent back. And you'll need a separate agreement. It's called a seller in possession SIP document. And you would use the SIP document if it's less than 30 days, 29 days or less. That's a one-page document, very easy to fill out. If the seller is going to remain there for more than 30 days, then you'll need a separate agreement. It's called the RLAS, and that's a more complicated document. It's 5 pages long, and that's for over 30 days. And if there is going to be a tenant, or there is currently a tenant, and you're going to specify if you want the tenant to, or the home to be vacant, or are they going to remain in place, then you would need a TIP. okay, a tenant in place. And then the seller will transfer everything. There's documentation in here or verbiage in here that says that the seller will transfer, you know, the warranties, the keys, the codes, the passwords, the garage door openers, things like that. Okay, that's closing and possession. All right, now we're going to come to a big section that talks about disclosures. And it's up to the seller to disclose everything they know about that house to the buyers. So they're going to provide the buyers with a lead-based paint disclosure, a transfer disclosure statement, which is called a TDS, which is everything that's transferring with the house. There's also that natural hazards disclosure statement, that NHDS. There's the seller property questionnaire, or SPQ. That's 4 pages of the seller telling the buyer everything that they know about the property. Yes, no checkboxes. If something says yes, then you're going to look at the line of why it is, and there'll be an explanation there from the seller. This is the seller telling the buyer everything that they know. Then there's also an agent's visual inspection disclosure, or an AVID, which is the agent telling everyone what they know, what they've seen visually in the house. Okay? Now, if anything comes up in the transaction as we're going through it, then the buyer needs to know that something has changed. Maybe there's a new disclosure, something broke, something I forgot to tell the buyer. That all needs to be brought up. Don't hold anything back. What I tell my clients is over disclose, okay? And there is the timing about when all these disclosures are supposed to be given to the buyer, and the timing on how long it takes for the buyer to sign and return all of those things. And that is located where? In paragraph 14. That's where all the timing is. Now, this is one thing, if I'm going to get one thing across to you in this presentation, it's the most important thing is to sell a home as is. The buyer needs all of the disclosures. They need to know everything there possibly could be known about that property before they write the offer. Because the contract says it's as is. Every home sold is as is until we find something we didn't know about. So really it's as is disclosed. And if you're not giving the buyer all the disclosures up front, and the buyer sends you an offer for $1 million, and then you give the buyer the disclosures, and they say, well, if now that I know that I've seen all of this stuff, I'm not going to give you $1 million. Now it's up for negotiation. Okay? So as is only as is disclosed. So the number one thing you need to know is do not accept an offer, or buyers don't write an offer until you've seen all the disclosures, signed them, and the disclosures should come with the offer to the seller saying, we've seen everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Here's our offer based on what we know. Now they can order their own their own inspections afterwards, and they probably won't find anything, but cards on the table, over disclose before the offer is placed. Okay? All right, so next thing is the actual condition of the property. Now I skipped a bunch of stuff there in the contract, but it's all just different disclosures. You should read all of this. Don't just skim through it. I'm trying to go as fast as I can. I might do this in 45 minutes, but if I did it in person, it'd probably be an hour and a half. It's an important contract to be reading. You're buying a house or selling a house, you should know everything that it says. Okay, now the condition of the property. It says right here, the property is sold in its as is in its present physical condition as of the date of acceptance. Okay? Until we find something we didn't know. And it says that the seller shall disclose known material facts and defects, and the buyer has the right to conduct their own investigations of the property. In fact, they're strongly advised to conduct investigations, okay? Within the time specified in section 14. We're going to get to that. And the seller shall make the property available for those investigations. And when the buyer gets those reports back, if the buyer does decide to do their own inspections, they're going to give those reports to the seller at no cost to the seller. Okay? And if that buyer backs out, little caveat here for the sellers, if that buyer backs out, those reports that you now have, Mr. Seller, you know about them, you have to disclose it to the next buyer that comes along. Just is what it is. And remember, we want to over-disclose, so it's not that bad. Okay, next thing is title and vesting. So the buyer shall be provided a preliminary title report, and we've already done that. It's part of our disclosures. They're going to sign it and send it in with their offer. The buyer is going to take title in its present condition, so subject to encumbrances, easements, covenants, conditions, restrictions, rights, all that kind of stuff. That's part of the property. All of that stuff. And the buyer is going to take title with all of that stuff. Now, here's another very important thing for the buyers. The way you take title, whether it's single, tenants in common, joint tenancy, community property with rights of survivorship, with a trust, that's all very, very, very important. So make sure you know how to take title, because you're going to go sign off those documents and they're going to ask you at the title company, how do you want to hold title? And I have a whole nother video on that you can, I'll send to you if you ask, that tells you all the different ways of holding title, the pros and cons of each. Okay? Especially if someone passes away, a co-owner passes away, how you're holding title could save you hundreds of thousands of dollars. Okay, now we come to the time periods, or the removal of contingency and your cancellation rights. This is it. Big section 14. It might be called section 15 someday. I'm just telling you it's called time periods, removal of contingencies, and cancellation rights. So all of the time periods can be extended or modified with addendums. Okay, but these are the standard what comes with the contract. So when you go to remove your contingencies, you will use the CR form, contingency removal form. If you're not going to remove your contingencies within these dates and you want to cancel the contract, you'll use a CC form, cancellation of contract. And it says in here that the seller has 7 days, or there's a blank line, to deliver the report's disclosures. But remember, the seller should be delivering those even before the offer is even written, okay? So I just want to keep reminding you of that. It just makes zero sense to send in an offer if no one's seen the disclosures, okay? So that's how long the seller has. Then the buyer has how many days to complete their buyer investigations. Standard is 17 days. This is a knob that the buyers can turn. As a seller, I want to see those contingencies removed as soon as possible. So that is what the seller wants, because until the contingencies are removed, that means the buyer can back out for any reason whatsoever. A black cat crosses this path. He doesn't like the axe murderer that lives next door. There's something, he lost his job. A buyer can back out very simply. Seller wants those contingencies to be removed sooner, because the seller wants to leave a dirty dish in the sink and not make their bed and not be so worried that the buyer's going to come over and then back out of the deal, okay? So the seller wants ASAP. The buyer wants those contingencies to remain in place as long as possible, because they're doing their due diligence and they want to be able to back out without losing that deposit, okay? So there's your time frames on the contingency removal. Now, some offers come in with removal of contingencies with the offer. The box is checked. Okay. If they're going to do that, they're going to attach the CR, the contingency removal form, with the contract. And they're going to remove all of their contingencies. Well, some or all. There's a few boxes on that contingency removal. One is we're removing them all except these ones, or there's leaving all of them. Okay. So, like I said, the seller does have a right to cancel, but it's not very easy for the seller to cancel. And if the seller does want to cancel, the seller, what they're going to do is let's say the buyer is not doing something that they were supposed to do in the time frame that they were supposed to do it in, then the seller is going to send over a document which is a notice for the buyer to perform, okay? NBP, it's a document. And that's usually about 2 days for the buyer to perform. So they're not removing their contingencies, they're not sending their documents signed back, something. The seller can't just say, you're out. The seller's gonna have to give them this document. The buyer will then say, okay, I'll do it. And then if they don't do it in that time frame, then the seller can cancel the contract. Now, if the seller cancels the contract or the buyer cancels the contract, you both still have to sign mutual instructions to tell the title company to refund the deposit back to the buyer. You both have to sign. If only one signs, then there's a problem. Okay, now we come to the final verification of condition. So what this is the buyer has the right to make a final verification of the property within about 5 days prior to the close of escrow. And the reason they're doing that is to see if it's still in the same condition it was when they placed the offer, that nothing new is found after the sellers have moved out, maybe that the repairs, if there were any agreed upon, that those repairs were made before the close of escrow. So there is that walkthrough. It always happens. And then we go on to the proration. Okay. Proration of property taxes, because the seller's property taxes, let's say they paid their property taxes in advance and they're not living there that full 6 months, they're going to get prorated and they're going to get money back for the time that they did not live in the home. And the buyer will start paying property taxes for the time that they did live in the home. So it's prorated. That's what that's pretty much saying. Okay. Now, there are some other items, miscellaneous items, and I'm just going to run right through these, is that the brokers will be compensated. So really the seller agrees to pay the brokers what the seller agreed to pay them in the listing agreement. And it talks about the scope of duty for brokers. And the brokers do not or shall not decide what price the buyer should pay, what price the seller should accept. They don't guarantee the condition of the property or the performance of the inspectors, or do an inspection themselves, or identify any defects, or inspect public records for permits, or identify the location of boundary lines, or verify the square footage, or determine the fair market value of the home, or providing any legal or tax advice. And if the buyer or the seller agree or need to seek legal advice, they'll go talk to a tax person or an insurance person or a title company person or something, those appropriate professionals, if they have some detailed questions. So that's just kind of indemnifying, holding harmless the brokers, because that's not their specialty. Okay. Now, if there is, let's say, a breach of contract or dispute resolution that needs to happen, we're going to talk about those liquidated damages, that 3% deposit. Remember that, the initial deposit. If the buyer fails to complete the purchase because of the buyer's default, then the seller shall retain, as what's called liquidated damages, the deposit that was paid. So I'm not saying that the seller just gets that money, but the seller can retain that money until we find out if the seller was damaged. Let's say you wanted to back out of the deal, the seller, and you already removed your contingencies. The seller has the right to retain that. And if the seller gets more for out of the second offer, the next offer that comes, then the seller wasn't damaged. But if the seller gets less than the buyer was going to give them, the seller was damaged by the buyer backing out, and that money is what's called up for grabs. I'm not saying the seller will get it. Maybe they'll get a portion of it, maybe they won't. So the amount retained is never going to be more than 3%. That's why the initial deposit is 3%. And remember, the release of the funds, once we figure it all out, both parties have to sign the release. Okay, so that's what that liquidated damages is. Now, we're also going to get to a point here when we're talking about dispute resolution. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through mediation and arbitration. So what you're saying is that both parties agree to mediate any dispute or claim arising between them out of the agreement. And the parties also agree to mediate any disputes actually with the broker too. So any issues that come up are going to try and be resolved through mediation rather than going to a grand jury, spending a ton of money on lawyers and things just to get $5,000 or something. Now, if mediation doesn't work, then we go to arbitration. So then the parties agree that any dispute which is not settled through mediation shall be decided by neutral, binding arbitration. And usually the arbitrators are an ex-judge or an attorney, and they have to have at least 5 years of real estate law experience. So one thing on that, if there's 3 places to put your initials on that document on mediation and arbitration. If the buyer doesn't do it and the seller does, the whole contract is null and void, and vice versa. They either both do it or none of them do it. Okay. So it's super important, and that's one of the things, first thing I'm going to see when I look at a contract. I'm going to make sure that everybody signed mediation and arbitration. Okay. Next thing is just some miscellaneous items of selection of service providers. So the broker, just more indemnification for the broker. The broker doesn't guarantee the performance of any of these vendors. And what the broker is also going to do is they're going to go onto the MLS, and once the property is the contract is ratified, then the status on the multiple listing service will go to pending, and then it'll go to sold. Okay. Also, some more miscellaneous house cleaning, attorney fees. If there are any attorney fees, the prevailing buyer or the seller shall be entitled to reasonable attorney fees. That's in any contract. And then there's a note here about assignment. So assignment is when, let's say, a buyer gets in contract for $1 million for a home, and then they find another buyer that would buy that home for $1.1 million. Well, they can sell that contract to that other buyer for $1.1 million. That guy just made $100,000, and now we've got a new buyer. That is not applicable. It's not permissible. And it says the buyer shall not assign this contract to another buyer. Okay, it's important. Used to do that a long time ago. Then more house cleaning. Equal housing opportunity. So it says that the property is sold in compliance with anti-discrimination laws, that there are terms and conditions of the offer. So this offer is to purchase the property based on the above terms and conditions, and that there's time frames in the contract. So time is of the essence. So you have to follow the time frames that were spelled out in the contract. And then on this page also is some definitions. So if you don't know what some words mean, there's your definitions. And at the bottom of that page is the expiration of the offer. The buyer's offer usually expires in 3 days. But if you want to make your, knob attractive to the seller, give the seller 3 days to respond. A lot of buyers, sometimes they're saying, well, you need to respond in 24 hours. That's a negative knob to turn. The seller does not want to be stressed knowing that this offer is going to expire in 24 hours. Now, some buyers are using it as a strategy. I don't like it as a listing agent, and I don't like to do that on my buyers, with my buyers as well. So then the buyers will sign. There is then the acceptance of the offer where the owner is saying that the seller is accepting the contract, okay? Or they could check a box that says acceptance is subject to the attached counteroffer, and then the seller will sign that. And when you're sending the counteroffer back to the buyer, you should send the contract as well. Okay, the next thing is called the confirmation of acceptance. It's on the last page of the contract, and this is for the buyer or the selling agent. So what happens is the buyer sends the contract over to the seller. It's signed. The seller reviews it. They either sign it, well, they're going to sign it and maybe send back a counter, but they're going to sign the offer and then they're going to send it back to the buyer. The buyer then needs to tell the seller, I got your accepted offer and I'm okay with that. I still want to buy it. Okay, so it has to go back and forth. Buyer sends to seller, seller sends back to buyer. Buyer has to acknowledge the confirmation of the acceptance of the offer. Because as a listing agent, how will I know if I'm in contract if I just send over a signed offer and I never hear anything back? Okay. Now, the completion of the confirmation is not legally required in order to create a binding agreement. So it's solely intended just kind of as evidence, but I want that back. I, as a listing agent, I want that warm, fuzzy feeling that the buyer saw that I got it back to them, okay? Then the realtor sign, and also make sure that the buyers sign at the bottom of the last page. It's a pretty sneaky little initials. It's not a signature, it's just initials on that last page. All right, we're almost done. We're off to the buyer's inspection advisory. We talked about that earlier, how a box was checked, making this part of the contract. And what this is this is the buyer beware. Okay, and what this is really saying is, Mr. Buyer, it's really important to do property inspections, investigations. So you're strongly advised to investigate the condition and the suitability of all aspects of the property. So the general condition of the property, the soil, the square footage, the age, the boundary lines, the pests, if there's any, the soil stability, square footage, the neighborhood noises and things, subdivisions, all that kind of stuff. The seller doesn't even have to sign this. This is solely for the buyer saying, you got to check things out. Be careful. Don't just go removing your contingencies before you've checked everything out. Okay? And the last document that you're going to see, it's called the California Consumer Privacy Act Advisory. And what this is saying is that some of your information, your personal information, will be collected and it'll likely be shared with others during the whole process of buying and selling real estate. And what that's doing is it's giving the real estate broker the information they need to put the home onto the MLS, right? The address, maybe the person's name. It's not going to be social security numbers and driver's license numbers, anything like that, but there is going to be personal information out there. There's going to be pictures, taken of the property. So the broker has no control over that. The broker has no control over third parties to the MLS, like Zillow and Trulia and things like that. That information just gets sucked out of the MLS. Now you can opt out of that, but it's going to really limit your exposure on the internet. The buyer might not be able to find the house. The buyer's agent won't know how to fill out the contract if they don't know who owns the house. So there is some of that information that will be shared. And you can opt out, but if you opt out, it's really limiting your exposure. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. So like I said, the goal for this video was to explain the purchase agreement very quickly, only to focus on the most important things. There's a lot of information in that document. So I did not go through every line. I didn't show you the contract physically because it's a copyrighted document, and the contract is always changing, so I didn't go through item numbers except for number 14. That's a biggie. And I also tried to make it for buyers and for sellers, okay? So hopefully I got that across to you. And just a reminder, the goal is win-win. We don't want to be adversarial. We want to try and be cooperative. The buyers are thinking they're paying too much. The sellers are thinking they gave it away. Everybody wants the same thing. We want to end on a good note. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, requests, you can always get in touch with me. I'm always available at the website, which is stayorgohomeowner.com. Lots of good free information there, and I hope you got something out of this, and I hope I went as quickly as I possibly could. Good luck with the purchase of your home. Good luck with the sale of your home, and I hope to hear from you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.